In a basement beneath the Henderson County Courthouse, under the hum of a single flickering fluorescent tube, Arthur Vance sliced through the packing tape of a cardboard box labeled Fiscal Year 1979. The sound, a sharp, tearing zip, echoed against the concrete walls like a gunshot in a library. Dust motes, undisturbed for 15 years, spiraled into the stagnant air. Vance didn't cough. He didn't wave the air in front of his face. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, pulled a ledger from the box, and laid it on the metal folding table with the reverence of a coroner examining a body. This is the story of how $1,200,000 vanished into thin air, right under the noses of an entire government and the quiet man who was sent to dig it back up. Welcome to the 1994 Henderson County Land Trust Audit. The room smelled of wet cardboard and decaying paper. It was October 14th, 1994. Arthur Vance had been in the building for 3 hours, and he had already determined that the filing system was not merely disorganized, it was defensive. It was designed to repel inspection. Boxes were stacked without chronological order. Some were labeled in black marker, others in blue ballpoint, some not at all. Vance checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. He took a seat on the cold metal chair. He was 62 years old, a man composed of sharp angles and absolute habits. He had spent 40 years in state auditing, tracing the flow of public money through the veins of bureaucracy. This was to be his final assignment. The state comptroller had framed it as a clean-up job, a routine reconciliation of a rural county's books before a statewide systems upgrade. Vance knew better. You don't send a senior forensic auditor to a basement in Henderson County unless you suspect the rot goes all the way to the foundation. He opened the 1979 ledger. The spine cracked. The pages were yellowed, covered in the tight, cursive handwriting of a bygone era. The voice came from the top of the stairs. Vance didn't close the book. He rotated his chair slowly. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the light from the hallway above, was Martha Jenkins. She was the county clerk, a woman who wore cardigans that seemed too large for her shrinking frame. She held a styrofoam cup of coffee with both hands, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Jenkins," Vance said. His voice was dry like shifting gravel. "Please, come down." She hesitated, descending the wooden steps carefully. The floorboards above creaked, settling under the weight of the morning foot traffic in the treasurer's office upstairs. Martha placed the coffee on the edge of Vance's table, well away from the documents. "I thought you might need this," she said. "It's black. Robert, Mr. Sterling, said that's how auditors drink it." "Mr. Sterling is correct," Vance said. He didn't reach for the cup. Martha pulled her cardigan tighter. This was the narrative Vance had been briefed on, the convenient computer virus that had allegedly corrupted the primary index of the land trust, just as the county was migrating from DOS-based entries to a networked system. Vance corrected gently, though his eyes remained cold. Martha stammered. Vance said. He opened the ledger on the table again, running his finger down a column of figures. She lingered for a second too long, her gaze darting to the open book, before turning and walking back up the stairs. Vance watched her go. He waited until the door clicked shut before he reached into his briefcase and pulled out his own supplies. A solar-powered calculator, a graph paper notebook, and a mechanical pencil with 0.5mm lead. He took a sip of the coffee. It was lukewarm. He set it aside and looked at the numbers. To understand the crime, Vance knew he had to understand the creation. The Henderson County Land Trust had been established in 1975, a golden era for the county. The region was booming with coal royalties and timber contracts. The county commissioners, led by the newly elected treasurer Robert Sterling, had devised the trust as a way to hold surplus tax revenue and unclaimed property sales in an interest-bearing escrow. It was meant to be a rainy day fund for public infrastructure. Robert Sterling had been 30 years old in 1975. Handsome, charismatic, a local football hero returned home with a finance degree. He was the golden boy. Vance had seen his picture in the hallway upstairs. a black and white photo of Sterling cutting the ribbon on the new courthouse annex in 1978, smiling like he owned the building. Vance turned his attention to the 1979 general ledger. He was looking for a baseline. Forensic accounting was not about finding the theft immediately. It was about establishing the rhythm of the money. Money had a heartbeat. It flowed in during tax season. It flowed out for payroll and vendors. It pulsed. He began to transcribe the monthly totals from the handwritten ledger into his graph notebook. January 1979, $14,200 in deposits. February 1979, $11,500 in deposits. March 1979, $42,000 in deposits, tax season influx. Vance worked for 2 hours in silence, the only sound the scratching of his pencil and the rhythmic tapping of the calculator keys. He reconstructed the fiscal year of 1979 manually. Then he stopped. He stared at the entry for August 14, 1979. In the handwritten ledger, the entry read, Sale of Parcel 4B, Northridge. Payment received, $62,500. The handwriting was bold, confident. It looked like Sterling's signature script, though initialized by a clerk. Vance reached into the box and pulled out the bundle of carbon copy deposit slips from the First National Bank of Henderson, bound together with a rotting rubber band. He flipped through them until he found August 1979. He found the slip for August 15th. The total deposit was $12,500. Vance frowned. He checked the dates again. Perhaps it was a late deposit. He checked August 16th, 17th, and 18th. He found a deposit on August 20th for $5,000. He found nothing else for the rest of the month that matched the magnitude of the Northridge sale. He went back to the ledger. Sale of Parcel 4B, $62,500. He went to the bank records. Total deposits for August, $17,500. There was a $50,000 gap. Vance sat back in the metal chair. $50,000 in 1979 was a fortune. It was the price of 2 decent houses. It wasn't a rounding error. It wasn't a misread digit. It was a crater. He felt a familiar sensation in his chest, the tightening of focus. This was the moment the job changed from an audit to an autopsy. He looked at the deposit slip again. It was stamped by the bank teller. It was real. The ledger entry was written in ink. It was real. Both documents claimed to represent reality, but one of them was a lie. Vance stood up. He needed the receipt book. The ledger was a summary. The bank slip was the destination. The receipt book was the origin. If the money came in, a receipt stub had to exist. He moved to the stack of boxes against the far wall. He found a box labeled, quote, 17, quote. He cut the tape. Thousands of pink and yellow carbon slips were jammed inside, loose and chaotic. Vance grabbed a handful and began sorting them by number on the table. He was looking for receipt number 1042 based on the sequence in the ledger. 1040. 1041. He found 1043. He searched the pile again. 1040. 1041. 1043. Receipt 1042 was missing. The carbon copy had been torn out of the book. Vance picked up receipt 1043. It was dated August 14th, 1979, the same day as the alleged sale. It was for a minor zoning fee, $15. He picked up receipt 1041, dated August 14th, 1979, a dog license fee, $10. The missing receipt, 1042, fell exactly between them. Vance whispered to the empty room. It was too simple. You don't steal $50,000 by just ripping a page out of a book and hoping no one notices, not unless you control the person checking the book. Or unless you never expected anyone to check the book at all. Vance returned to his graph paper. He wrote, August 1979 discrepancy, minus $50,000. Missing receipt number 1042. He needed to verify the pattern. Was this a one-time theft A desperate grab?
Or was it the start of a system?
He moved to 1980. He spent the next 4 hours grinding through the years. The air in the basement grew heavy and stale. His eyes strained in the poor light. By 2 p.m., Vance had identified 3 more instances. November 1980. A land auction proceed listed in the ledger as $28,000. Bank deposit, $8,000. May 1981. A state grant transfer listed as $110,000. Bank deposit, $90,000. February 1982. Commercial rezoning fees listed as $15,000. Bank deposit, $5,000. The method was consistent. The ledger, the book that remained in the treasurer's office, the book the county commissioners saw during their quarterly meetings, showed the full amount. It showed a healthy, growing trust. But the bank deposits, the actual cash hitting the account, were skimmed. Vance did the math. In 3 years, nearly $100,000 had been diverted, and yet the books balanced. How? He rubbed his temples. If the ledger says you have $100 and the bank says you have $80, eventually a check will bounce. You can't fake solvency forever. Unless you are bringing money in from somewhere else to cover the holes, or you are inflating the assets to hide the cash flow problem. The door at the top of the stairs opened again. This time the footsteps were heavier, rapid, confident. Robert Sterling descended the stairs. He had aged since the 1978 photo. His hair was silver, swept back in an immaculate wave. He wore a navy suit that cost more than Vance's car. He didn't look like a man under siege. He looked like a host greeting a guest at a party. Sterling's voice was a rich baritone. He bypassed the last 2 steps with a youthful hop. Vance stood up slowly. He closed the graph notebook, but he did not cover it. Sterling laughed. He walked over to the table, leaning his hands on the edge. He glanced at the stacks of paper, the open ledger, the calculator. His eyes lingered on the 1979 ledger for a fraction of a second, then snapped back to Vance. Vance said. He kept his face neutral. He was studying Sterling's micro-expressions. The treasurer was projecting ease, but his thumbs were pressing hard against the metal table. Sterling chuckled. Vance repeated. Sterling said, shaking his head. Vance said. The air in the room changed. It didn't get colder. It got still. Sterling didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. 1979 to 82. That would be the breakdown period. Breakdown period? Vance asked. Old Mrs. Higgins, Sterling said, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence. She was the head clerk before Martha. God rest her soul, she passed in 85. In her last few years, well, her mind wasn't what it used to be. She'd write things down in the ledger, then forget to go to the bank for a week, or she'd bundle checks and leave them in a drawer. We found checks under her desk months after they were written. It was a nightmare to untangle. I suspect you're seeing the ghosts of her dementia. It was a good lie, plausible, emotional, hard to verify because the subject was dead. Vance nodded slowly. I see. So the discrepancies are due to delayed deposits? Exactly, Sterling said, straightening up. The money always got there eventually, just not always when the book said it did. Poor woman. We didn't have the heart to fire her. That is very compassionate, Vance said. However, I'm seeing specific amounts missing. For example, in August 1979, a $50,000 difference. That seems large for a clerical oversight. Sterling waved a hand dismissively. Transactions were bundled differently back then. Sometimes a land sale would be recorded, but the buyer was paying in installments. The ledger showed the full sale price, but the bank only saw the down payment. Cash basis versus accrual. Mrs. Higgins mixed them up constantly. Another good lie. Mixing up accounting methods was a common error in rural counties. I'll keep that in mind as I proceed, Vance said. You do that, Sterling said. He checked his gold wristwatch. I have a Rotary meeting. I just wanted to welcome you personally. If you need anything at all, you come to me. Don't harass poor Martha. She gets anxious when the state suits are around. I will be thorough, Vance said. "I know you will." Sterling turned to leave. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused. "You know, Arthur, everyone makes mistakes, especially in the days of pen and paper. The important thing is that the trust is solvent today, and it is. Very solvent." He walked up the stairs. Vance listened to the footsteps fade. He waited a full minute. Then, he opened his notebook again. He wrote, "Explanation offered. Incompetence of deceased clerk, Higgins. Theory, accrual versus cash basis error." Vance looked at the data he had extracted. If Sterling was right, and the $62,500 entry in the ledger was the full price, and the $12,500 deposit was just a down payment, then there should be subsequent payments over the following months, totaling the remaining $50,000. Vance pulled the deposit slips for September 1979 through August 1980. He went through every single slip. He looked for payments of $1,000, $5,000, anything that could be an installment for the Northridge sale. He found nothing. No installment payments. The $50,000 hadn't come in later. It hadn't come in at all. Sterling's explanation was a fabrication. Vance felt a cold anger simmering in his gut. He hated being lied to. He hated the waste of it. But mostly, he hated the arrogance. Sterling thought that because the ink was dry and the paper was old, no one would do the math. Vance moved to the next phase of his methodology. If the money wasn't in the bank, where did the ledger say it went? In double-entry bookkeeping, every credit has a debit. If you record $62,500 coming in, you have to account for it. He looked at the 1982 ledger again. He flipped to the end of the year. The quote 49 for 1983 was listed as $1,450,000. Vance picked up the bank statement for December 31st, 1982. The bank balance was $1,450,000. Vance froze. This was impossible. He had just found nearly $100,000 in missing deposits over 3 years. The bank account should be $100,000 lighter than the ledger. But they matched. Perfect symmetry. This was the magic trick. This was the quote 50 part that put other auditors to sleep. The totals always matched. How do you make the totals match when you are stealing money? You falsify the assets. If you steal cash, you have to create a fake asset to fill the hole in the balance sheet. A fake IOU, a fake bond, or a fake land deed. The Henderson County Land Trust held land. The value of the trust was a combination of cash on hand and land assets held for sale. Vance realized what he had to do. He had to cross-reference the ledger entries not with the bank, but with the physical reality of the county geography. He stood up and walked to the wall of, quote, 51. Quote, these were massive leather-bound tomes, weighing 20 pounds each. They contained the legal history of every square inch of Henderson County. He went back to the ledger. He needed a specific entry, one that looked suspicious. He found an entry dated July 12, 1982. Ledger entry number 1142, acquisition of property, 12 acres, Miller's Creek, value assigned $85,000. According to the books, the trust had purchased this land or accepted it in lieu of taxes, adding $85,000 to the trust's value. This asset would sit on the books, padding the total, hiding the fact that cash was missing from the bank. Vance hauled the 1982 deed book onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. He opened it to July. He scanned the index. July 10th, July 11th, July 14th. There was no entry for July 12th. There was no deed for 12 acres, Miller's Creek. Vance felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He checked the page numbers. Page 410, page 412. Page 411 had been carefully, surgically removed with a razor blade. A jagged strip of paper remained near the binding. Vance ran his thumb over the rough edge of the missing page. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a dead woman's dementia. Someone had created a ghost asset in the financial ledger to balance the books, and then physically destroyed the legal record to prevent anyone from checking the details. The missing money wasn't just gone, it had been replaced by phantom earth.
Arthur Vance looked up at the ceiling, toward the floorboards where Robert Sterling was likely shaking hands and signing letters. "Got you," he whispered. He reached for his pen. The audit had officially begun. But it wasn't a standard ballpoint he pulled from his breast pocket. It was a mechanical pencil, 0.5mm lead, the tool of a man who expected to make mistakes and needed the ability to erase them, though he knew that in this specific ledger, erasure was the enemy. He opened his own notebook, a spiral-bound legal pad that had seen the interiors of corrupt union halls in Chicago and bankrupt textile mills in Georgia. He wrote the date, the time, and then, in block letters, discrepancy, A1, Vol, 1982, PG 411, missing, Ref Ledger, 1142. He didn't stop there. One missing page was a curiosity, a pattern was a conviction. Vance stood up, his knees cracking in the damp silence of the archive room. The air down here tasted of stale dust and iron, the flavor of secrets kept too long in the dark. He moved back to the shelves, his eyes scanning the spines of the deed books. They were arranged chronologically, a timeline of ownership that stretched back to the founding of the county. He needed to broaden the sample size. If Sterling, or whoever was pulling the strings, was smart, they would have varied the method. But criminals, in Vance's experience, were rarely creative once they found a mechanism that worked. They were creatures of inertia. If the razor blade worked in 82, it likely worked in 83. He hauled 3 more volumes onto the table, 1984, 1986, and 1989. The sound of them hitting the wood was heavy, deadened, like bodies dropping. He returned to the financial ledger, flipping pages with a wet thumb, hunting for the symmetry. He needed large, round numbers. Fraudsters hated uneven cents. They liked clean aesthetics. $50,000. $125,000. Real estate transactions were messy. They involved prorated taxes, closing costs, weird percentages. Clean numbers were a red flag waving in a hurricane. He found one in February of 1984. Ledger entry number 1409. Land swap acquisition. The Vane parcel. Value assigned $110,000. Vance turned to the 1984 deed book. He found the index. Vane, Vane, Vane. There was a Vane listed. Vane Thomas, Lot 44, page 202. Vance felt a momentary flicker of disappointment. Was it legitimate? He flipped to page 202. The deed was there. It was a transfer of a residential lot, 0.2 acres, for a consideration of $110,000. No. He squinted at the faded type. The consideration listed on the legal deed was $10,000. Vance looked back at the ledger. The trust had recorded the asset value at $110,000. They had bought a $10,000 patch of dirt and recorded it as a $110,000 asset. That meant $100,000 in cash had left the bank account, ostensibly to pay for this land. But only $10,000 had gone to Thomas Vane. Where was the other $100,000? He looked closer at the deed in the book, the notary stamp at the bottom. Commission expires May 1985. The signature of the notary was a scrawl, barely legible, but the witness signature, that was clearer. Witness, R. Sterling. Vance exhaled, a long, slow breath that disturbed the dust motes dancing in the cone of light from the single bulb overhead. Sterling hadn't just cooked the books. He had been in the room when the deal went down. He had likely handed Thomas Vane a check for $10,000 and pocketed the difference, then instructed the bookkeeper to inflate the value. It was bold. It was arrogant. It relied on the assumption that no one would ever look at the deed and the ledger at the same time. The auditor looks at the ledger. The lawyer looks at the deed. The two professions rarely spoke the same language, let alone occupied the same basement. Vance worked for the next 3 hours. He fell into a trance state, a rhythmic fugue of forensic excavation,
Lift book, open ledger, cross-reference, document. Lift book, open ledger, cross-reference, document. The pile of evidence grew. 1986. Purchase of, quote, 55 North Quadrant. Ledger value, $65,000. Deed. Book 1986.
No entry for underscore quote 56 underscore in the grantor-grantee index for that month. But on the page where it should have been, page 58, another surgical excision. The page was gone. 1989. Capital improvement, access road for trust lands. Cost, $42,000. There are no deeds for roads usually, but there are easements. Vance checked the county engineering maps rolled up in the corner tubes. He found the map for 1989. He unrolled it, weighing down the corners with the heavy deed books. He traced the coordinates listed in the ledger. The coordinates pointed to the middle of the Henderson Reservoir. They had built a $40,000 road into a lake. Vance sat back, rubbing his temples. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't just skimming. This was a systematic looting of the county's wealth, converted into phantom dirt and water, spanning at least a decade. The trust was a hollow shell. It was a list of lies bound in leather. He looked at his watch. 4:45 p.m. The offices upstairs would be closing soon. The secretaries would be covering their typewriters. The lights would be clicked off. If he was still down here when they locked up, he'd be trapped, or worse, found. He needed to leave, but he couldn't leave the books like this. The open volumes were an accusation. He began to close them, stacking them back on the shelves with precise care. He had to ensure the dust patterns looked undisturbed. He wiped the table where his elbows had rested. He aligned the spines of the books exactly as they had been, flush with the edge of the shelf. He picked up his notebook. This was the dangerous part, carrying the evidence out. He tucked the notebook into the waistband of his trousers, beneath his dress shirt, tightening his belt. If they asked to check his briefcase, unlikely but possible, they wouldn't find it. He climbed the wooden stairs, each step groaning like a warning. He reached the door at the top. He paused, listening. The murmur of voices, the clacking of a typewriter slowing down, the ching of a carriage return. Vance turned the knob and stepped out. The light in the main office was blinding after the gloom of the archives. The fluorescent tubes hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. Mrs. Gable, the severe-looking secretary who had let him in, looked up from her desk. She was applying lipstick, a violent shade of red that bled slightly into the wrinkles around her mouth. "Find what you were looking for, Mr. Vance?" she asked. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping on pavement. Vance summoned a smile. It was a practiced expression, one he kept in a jar for moments like this. "Just getting the lay of the land, Mrs. Gable. Familiarizing myself with the filing system. It's quite extensive." "Mr. Sterling is very particular about records," she said, snapping her compact shut. "He believes history is important." "I can see that," Vance said. "He certainly has left a mark on the history of this county." A door opened behind Mrs. Gable. Robert Sterling emerged from his inner office. He was a tall man, wearing a suit that cost more than Vance's car. He had the kind of tan that spoke of afternoons on a boat, not labor in a field. His hair was silver, perfectly coiffed, a lion's mane for the king of Henderson County. Sterling boomed. He had a voice made for speeches and ribbons being cut. He walked around the desk, hand extended. Vance took the hand. It was dry and warm. The grip was firm. The hand of a man with nothing to hide, or a man who believed he was untouchable. Vance said. He kept his own grip neutral. Sterling's eyes didn't flicker. They were a pale, icy blue. "We do our best with limited resources. Efficiency is the goal." "Symmetry seems to be the goal," Vance corrected gently. "The books are remarkably balanced." For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, the warmth left Sterling's face. The smile didn't drop, but it froze. The eyes sharpened. He had heard the double entendre. He was assessing Vance, weighing him, deciding if he was a threat or just another bureaucrat speaking in platitudes. Sterling said softly. Vance said. Sterling repeated. He checked his watch, a gold Rolex that glinted under the lights.
Vance said. Sterling laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that didn't reach his eyes. A dedicated man. I like that. Good evening, Mr. Vance. Sterling swept out of the office, the air disturbed by his passing, smelling of expensive cologne and old money. Vance nodded to Mrs. Gable. Good night, ma'am.
Don't forget to sign out, she said, pointing to the logbook. Vance signed. He used his own pen this time. He walked out into the heat of the late afternoon. The town of Henderson was picturesque. Main Street was lined with oaks. The storefronts were brick and glass. It looked like the kind of town where nothing bad ever happened. It was a facade. Vance knew that now. The whole town was floating on a bubble of stolen cash. He walked to his rental car, a beige Ford Taurus that blended into the asphalt. He didn't get in immediately. He stood by the door, lighting a cigarette. He didn't smoke often, only when the puzzle pieces started to fit and the picture they formed was ugly. He needed to verify the physical reality. The books were one thing, the earth was another. Paper could be cut with a razor. Land was harder to fake. He pulled the map he had sketched in his notebook out of his pocket. He looked at the first entry he had found. 12 acres, Miller's Creek. He unfolded a road map of the county he'd bought at a gas station. He triangulated the location. Miller's Creek ran along the western edge of the county, bordering the forest preserve. Vance got in the car. He threw the cigarette out the window and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught. He drove out of town, watching the rear-view mirror. No one was following him. Not yet. Sterling was arrogant, but he wasn't paranoid. He didn't think a man in a cheap suit was a danger. He thought the missing page was enough protection. The drive took 20 minutes. The pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt. The trees closed in, a tunnel of green. He reached the coordinates for Miller's Creek. He stopped the car. The silence of the woods descended. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind. Vance stepped out. He consulted his notes. 12 acres. Acquisition 1982. He walked toward the sound of water. He pushed through a thicket of briars. He found the creek. It was a trickle of brown water moving sluggishly over stones. But the land. He looked at the banks. On the north side there was a steep limestone bluff rising 50 feet into the air. Vertical, jagged rock. Unbuildable, unusable. On the south side, where the 12 acres should have been, there was a marsh. A deep, sinking bog filled with cattails and standing water. Vance stepped onto the edge of the mud. His shoes sank immediately. This wasn't land. This was a sinkhole. No one would buy this. No one would pay $85,000 for a vertical cliff and a swamp. But there was something else. He saw a rusted metal sign, half swallowed by an oak tree that had grown around it. He waded through the tall grass to reach it. He brushed away the ivy. Condemned, 1975. The county already owned this land. They had owned it 7 years before the trust, quote, 82, it. Sterling had sold the county its own land. He had taken public land, condemned and worthless, created a fake seller, and used the trust's money to buy it from himself or his shell company. It was circular theft. Vance took a disposable camera from his glove compartment. He snapped a photo of the cliff. He snapped a photo of the swamp. He snapped a photo of the rusted sign with the 1975 date. The winding mechanism of the camera sounded like a gunshot in the quiet woods. He got back in the car. The sun was setting now, casting long, bruised shadows across the road. He had enough for an indictment, but an indictment required a prosecutor who wasn't in Sterling's pocket. And in a town like this, the prosecutor, the judge, and the thief often played golf together on Sundays. Vance needed to follow the money. The seller of the land. Who was he? The ledger didn't list a name for the Miller's Creek purchase, just, quote, 84, quote. But the check had to go somewhere. He needed the cancelled checks. Those wouldn't be in the basement. Those would be at the bank, the First National Bank of Henderson. And banks kept microfiche. Vance put the car in gear. He wasn't going back to the motel. He was going to find a payphone. He needed to call his contact at the state attorney's office. He needed a subpoena for the bank records, and he needed it before Sterling realized the quote 85 was actually an executioner.
As he drove back toward the main road, a set of headlights appeared behind him. High beams, blinding. Vance squinted. He tapped his brakes, signaling the car to pass. The car didn't pass. It stayed right on his bumper. A large truck, a pickup. Vance accelerated. The truck accelerated. The road was narrow, twisting. "Okay," Vance muttered, gripping the wheel. "Now we're playing." He took a sharp right turn, kicking up a cloud of dust. The truck followed, swinging wide, tires crunching on the gravel.
Vance knew he couldn't outrun a local on these back roads. He had to outthink them. He saw a break in the trees ahead, a logging trail barely visible. He killed his headlights. He slammed on the brakes and swerved left, wrestling the heavy steering wheel. The Taurus skidded, sliding sideways into the brush. The truck roared past, its high beams cutting through the dust cloud Vance had left behind, missing him by inches. Vance held his breath. He watched the red taillights of the truck disappear around the bend. He waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The truck didn't come back. They weren't trying to kill him, not yet. They were trying to scare him. They were telling him to go home. Vance turned the key. He didn't turn his lights back on. He drove by the light of the moon, crawling back toward the highway. "Wrong move," he whispered to the empty car. "You just confirmed everything." He reached the paved road and turned toward the city limits, but not toward his motel. That room was burned. If they knew his car, they knew where he was sleeping. He drove to the next town over, a place called Oak Haven, 20 miles away. He found a Motel 6 with a flickering neon sign. He checked in under the name Anderson, cash up front. In the safety of the room, with the chain lock fastened and a chair propped under the doorknob, Vance spread his evidence on the cheap bedspread. The notebook, the map. He began to construct a timeline. 1982 to 1989. Total estimated theft, $1.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, it was a fortune. Enough to buy the loyalty of a sheriff, a mayor, a judge. He picked up the phone book on the nightstand. He looked up. Sterling, Robert. There was a home address. 101 Summit Drive. Of course, the richest street in town. Vance looked at the map again. Summit Drive was on a hill overlooking the town. Then he saw it. The access road from the 1989 ledger. The one that went into the lake. He traced the line again. The coordinates were wrong in his initial assumption. He had misread the survey minutes. The road didn't go into the lake. It went around the lake, to the north side, to a private peninsula. Vance traced the road on the map. It ended at a large, unlisted parcel of land. And right next to that parcel, 101 Summit Drive. The trust hadn't just stolen money. They had used public funds to build a private driveway for Robert Sterling's estate, disguised as a capital improvement project. $42,000 of taxpayer money to pave the king's driveway. Vance laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. It was so petty yet so grand. He sat down at the small desk and began to type on his portable typewriter. It was time to draft the preliminary report. Subject: systematic embezzlement and misappropriation of assets within the Henderson County Land Trust. Investigator: Arthur Vance. He typed through the night. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The adrenaline was a hum in his blood. By dawn, the report was 10 pages long. It was a roadmap to prison for half the town council. But he needed one last thing. He needed the link between the fake sellers and Sterling. He needed to know who Thomas Vane really was. If Vane was a real person, he could be flipped. He could be a witness. Vance showered, washing off the dust of the archives and the sweat of the chase. He put on his second suit, navy blue, polyester blend. He drank the terrible motel coffee. He drove back into Henderson at 8 a.m. He went to the public library. He found the phone book archives, 1984. Vane, Thomas. There was an address, 44 Elm Street. Vance drove to 44 Elm Street. It was a cemetery, the Elm Street Cemetery. Vance parked the car. He walked through the iron gates. The grass was wet with dew. He walked the rows. He found it near the back. A modest headstone. Thomas Vane, 1920 to 1983. He died in 1983. The land deal happened in 1984. Sterling had used a dead man's name to forge the deed. He had likely used a dead man's identity to open a bank account, cashed the check and closed it. "Ghost assets," Vance said aloud. "Ghost sellers." It was perfect. The dead don't complain. The dead don't testify. Except today. Today, Thomas Vane was going to speak. Vance drove to the county clerk's office, not the trust, but the civil records. He requested the death certificate for Thomas Vane. The clerk, a young woman chewing gum, handed it over for $2. Cause of death, heart failure. Informant, Mary Vane, widow. There was a surviving spouse. If Sterling had forged Vane's signature, Mary Vane would know. Or she would know that her husband couldn't have signed a deed a year after he was buried. Vance looked up Mary Vane in the current book. She was still listed. A different address now. A nursing home on the outskirts of town. Shady Oaks. Vance drove there. The building smelled of antiseptic and boiled cabbage. He found Mary Vane in the solarium, watching a game show. She was frail, her skin like parchment, but her eyes were bright. "Mrs. Vane?" She looked up. "Yes? My name is Arthur Vance. I'm looking into some old paperwork regarding your husband, Thomas." Her face softened. "Tom? Oh, I miss him so. I know this is difficult, ma'am, but did Thomas own a piece of land? A small lot, maybe the Vane parcel." "We had a garden plot," she said. "Sold it years ago, before he passed." "Before he passed?" Vance asked gently. "Oh, yes. 1980, I think. We sold it to the city for a park." "Mrs. Vane, the records show he sold it in 1984, for $110,000. The old woman laughed, a wheezing, rattling sound. $100,000? Honey, we sold that patch of dirt for $500. And Tom died in 83. God rest his soul. Do you have the paperwork from the 1980 sale?" "I keep everything," she said, "in my shoebox, under the bed. I never throw anything away." Vance felt a surge of triumph. The shoebox, the enemy of the embezzler, the meticulous hoarding of the honest poor. "Mrs. Vane, would you mind if we looked at that shoebox?" 10 minutes later, he held it in his hands. A yellowed receipt. "Received from Henderson County, $500, for quitclaim deed, dated August 4th, 1980. It was proof. Sterling had bought the land legitimately for the county in 1980 for $500. He had hidden the deed. Then, in 1984, he had forged a new deed from the dead Thomas Vane to the trust for $110,000 and pocketed the difference. He wasn't just buying fake land, he was reselling land the county already owned back to itself at a 20,000% markup. Vance looked at Mrs. Vane. "110?" she asked. Vance asked to borrow the receipt. She agreed, trusting his honest face. He walked out of the nursing home. He had the missing page, in his mind, the ghost geography, and now the contradiction. He had everything. But he couldn't go to the police. The sheriff was likely the one driving the truck last night. He needed to go higher. The FBI. The nearest field office was in the state capital, 3 hours away. He got in his car. He placed the receipt in his breast pocket, next to his heart. He started the engine. He pulled out of the parking lot. As he turned onto the highway, he saw it again. The pickup truck. It was idling on the shoulder. Dark green. Mud flaps with chrome girls. The driver wasn't hiding this time. He pulled out, blocking the road. Another truck pulled out behind Vance, boxing him in. Vance looked left. A ditch. He looked right. A field. He wasn't going to make it to the capital. He locked the doors. "Okay," Vance said. He picked up his notebook. He wrote one final line. "If found, give this book to Agent Miller, FBI." He shoved the notebook under the passenger seat. He put the car in drive. If they wanted to stop him, they were going to have to wreck him. And Arthur Vance, auditor, boring man of numbers, slammed his foot on the gas and aimed straight for the truck in front of him. The math was simple. Force equals mass times acceleration. It was time to balance the books.
The impact was not the cinematic explosion Arthur Vance had anticipated. It was a violent, jarring redistribution of kinetic energy.
His sedan struck the rear quarter panel of the blocking truck, the steel crumpling with a sound like a grinding industrial press. The airbag detonated, a hot, white punch to the face that filled the cabin with the smell of burnt chemicals and talc. Vance's car spun, tires shrieking across the asphalt, before sliding backward into the drainage ditch he had noted only seconds prior. The vehicle tilted precariously, mud slapping against the passenger window, before settling at a 45-degree angle. Silence returned to the highway, broken only by the hiss of his radiator. Vance blinked. His glasses were gone. His chest ached where the seatbelt had locked, a rigid bruise forming over his heart, right where the receipt lay in his pocket. He checked his extremities. Fingers moved, toes moved. The notebook was still wedged under the passenger seat. He heard a door slam. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel shoulder. Vance fumbled for the door handle. It was jammed. He looked up through the shattered spiderweb of his windshield to see the silhouette of the truck driver standing on the road's edge, looking down into the ditch. The driver held a tire iron. Then, a siren wailed in the distance, not the local sheriff's chirp, but the deeper, undulating howl of the Kentucky State Police. The driver on the road stiffened. He looked toward the sound, then back at Vance. He spat on the ground, turned, and ran back to his truck. The engine roared, and the green pickup peeled away, leaving tire marks on the pavement. Vance let his head rest against the deployed airbag. The math had worked. He had calculated the arrival time of the patrol cars he'd passed 10 miles back, gambling that the commotion would draw them in. It was a variable he had introduced into the equation at the last possible second. 3 days later, Arthur Vance sat in a motel room on the outskirts of the state capital, his left arm in a sling and his ribs tightly taped. The pain was a dull, rhythmic throb that he found easy enough to ignore when he focused on the papers spread across the cheap laminate table. He had discharged himself from the county hospital against medical advice. The attending physician, a man who played golf with Treasurer Robert Sterling on Sundays, had been too insistent on keeping Vance sedated. Vance had walked out the back door while the nurses were changing shifts, taking a taxi 3 towns over. He needed a secure environment. The receipt from 1980 proved the initial fraud, but it was a single data point. To indict Sterling and dismantle the machine, Vance needed to understand the evolution of the theft. A system that siphons $1.2 million over a decade does not stay static. It adapts. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized from the county directory. "County clerk's office?" a trembling voice answered. "Martha," Vance said. His voice was raspy. "Don't hang up." "Mr. Vance, they said you were transferred to a specialist."
"I was. I'm specializing in survival now. Listen to me carefully, Martha. The sheriff tried to run me off Route 9. They are done hiding. If they are willing to wreck a car to stop an auditor, what do you think they will do to the clerk who signed the checks?" Silence on the line. Then, the sound of a ragged breath. "I didn't take any money," Martha Jenkins whispered. "I just did what Mr. Sterling told me. He said it was for the bridge repairs. He said the accounts were just moving." "I know you didn't take it, Martha, but you validated the ledger entries. That makes you an accessory to grand larceny and conspiracy, unless you help me close the gap. What do you want?" "The 1985 through 1992 reconciliation reports, the ones that aren't in the main filing cabinets. I know they exist. Sterling is too careful to destroy his own insurance policy. Where are they?"
"Storage Unit B," she said, her voice barely audible, "beneath the old armory. He keeps the key in his desk, but I have a copy. I kept it because I was scared I'd get blamed if things went missing. Meet me there in 2 hours. Bring the key. If you aren't there, I hand the 1980 receipt to the FBI, and I mention your name first." The basement of the Henderson County Armory smelled of mildew and decaying paper. It was a heavy, subterranean silence that Vance appreciated. Martha Jenkins stood by the door, clutching her purse, her eyes darting toward the stairs every few seconds. "Leave the door open," Vance said. "If anyone comes down,
Run.
He turned his attention to the rows of bankers' boxes stacked on metal shelving. This was the graveyard of the county's fiscal history. He moved to the section marked 1983 to 1988. Vance pulled a box labeled FY 1985, Vendor Invoices. He opened it. The smell of old carbon paper wafted out. He began to read. The early years of the scheme, as evidenced by the 1983 and 1984 ledgers, were crude. Sterling had been forging deeds and buying land at inflated prices. But by 1985, the strategy had shifted. Land transfers were public record. Too many people could notice a plot of land being sold 3 times in 2 years. Sterling had needed a way to extract money without moving dirt. Vance found the first anomaly in a ledger from October 1985. Check number 4402, $4,200, office supply replenishment. Vendor, Tri-State Logistics. Vance cross-referenced this with the stub book. The stub for number 4402 was blank. He pulled the next box, looking for the physical invoice from Tri-State Logistics. It wasn't there.
He moved to 1986. The frequency of these blank stub payments increased. Check number 5110, $8,500, consulting fees. Check number 5115, $6,300, retainer. Martha, Vance said, not looking up. In 1986, the county switched banks, from First National to Henderson Community. Why? Martha jumped at the sound of her name. Mr. Sterling said the service fees were too high at First National. No, Vance muttered. First National implemented a dual signature requirement for all checks over $5,000 in 1986. Henderson Community didn't. He traced the pattern. Sterling had moved the funds to a bank with laxer security protocols to bypass the oversight committee. It was a simple, analog workaround. But then came 1988. Vance pulled the box marked 1988, System Migration. This was the year Henderson County had computerized. They had purchased a massive, humming mainframe and a series of terminals to digitize the tax rolls and expense tracking. It was supposed to be the dawn of efficiency. For Sterling, it must have been a terrifying threat. Computers create trails. They timestamp entries. They flag discrepancies, unless you control the input. Vance found a binder labeled IT Incident Reports, 1988. He flipped it open. The first page was a memo from the installation contractor. Subject, Data Loss Event. Date, November 12, 1988. Summary. Due to the Friday the 13th virus affecting the master boot record, approximately 14% of the vendor history from Q3 1988 was corrupted and unrecoverable. The virus, Vance said softly, the perfect alibi. He looked at the printed spreadsheets from December 1988. They were clean, too clean. The digital records showed a perfectly balanced budget. Martha, who performed the data entry after the crash? Who typed the records back in from the paper files? We hired temporary girls, Martha said, but Mr. Sterling, he stayed late. He said he wanted to verify their work. He was here every night for 3 weeks. Vance nodded. Sterling hadn't just verified the work, he had rewritten history. Vance compared the paper check register from October 1988, which he had just dug out of a mislabeled box, with the dot matrix printout of the same month. Paper register. Check number 8901, $12,500, Bluegrass Development, Project Management. Digital printout. Check number 8901, $12,500, County Road Maintenance Fund, Aggregate Material. There it was, the quote 139. Sterling had used the chaos of the computerization and the convenient cover of a virus scare to alter the payee names in the digital system. He wrote checks to his shell companies, but entered them into the computer as legitimate expenses like quote 140 quote or quote 141 quote. The bottom line numbers balanced. $12,500 went out in both versions, but the destination was disguised. The paper records were thrown in these boxes, destined to rot, while the digital records became the official truth. Vance stood up, his ribs flaring with pain. He walked over to a stack of floppy disks in the corner of the shelf. He picked one up. System Patch 4.1, 1988. Quote, 142, Vance asked. Quote, 143, Martha said. Quote, 144. Vance pocketed the disk. It wasn't a vendor patch. It was a back door. He suspected that if he could find a machine to run it, he would find a line of code that disabled the vendor verification logic for any payee marked with a specific character string. He went back to the boxes. He needed to find Bluegrass Development. The name had appeared on the paper register he just found. He traced it forward into 1989 and 1990. In the digital era, the theft became elegant. The paper checks were gone, replaced by pin feed checks printed directly from the system. Vance found a folder of voided checks. He sifted through them until he found what he was looking for. A printer alignment test page from 1990. On the test page, the printer had spit out a list of active vendors. Vendor 001, KY Power. Vendor 002, Water District. Vendor 003, Bluegrass Dev. Vendor 004, Office Depot. Vance stared at Vendor 003. Martha, did we ever hire a developer for the East County Wetlands project? No, she said. That project was cancelled in '89. Then why did we pay Bluegrass Development $4,000 a month for 36 months? Vance pulled the ledger for 1991. The payments were consistent, steady, clinical. They weren't lump sums anymore. They were salary-sized bites. Sterling wasn't stealing a fortune in a heist. He was drawing a second income. He found a memo in the back of the 1991 binder. It was written by a junior accountant who had worked for the county for 3 months before quitting. To Robert Sterling, Treasurer. From T. Miller. Re. Vendor 003, discrepancy. Sir, I cannot find a tax ID or a physical address for Bluegrass Development in our files. The checks are being mailed to a P.O. box in Louisville. I have halted the September payment pending your review. Beneath the typed text was a handwritten note in Sterling's expansive script. Miller, Bluegrass is a state-level consultant for the audit prep. They are exempt from local filing. Release the check immediately. R.S. He fired Miller, didn't he? Vance asked. Mr. Miller quit, Martha said. He said the stress was too much. Sterling fired him, Vance corrected, or threatened him. Vance held up the memo. This was the smoking gun of intent. Sterling had been challenged, had lied in writing to a subordinate, and had forced the payment through. Where is the file for Bluegrass Development? Vance asked. The physical file. There isn't one, Martha said. Mr. Sterling kept those papers in his briefcase. He said they were confidential state matters. Vance closed his eyes. Of course. No file. Just a name in a database and a P.O. box. Martha, Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper, I need you to tell me about the mail. The mail? When the cancelled checks came back from the bank, the envelopes. Who opened them? I did, she said, usually. And the checks made out to Bluegrass Development, where were they endorsed? Martha frowned, thinking back. They were stamped, just a deposit stamp, no signature. What bank? I don't remember. Vance grabbed a box of bank statements from 1992. He ripped it open. He found the reconciliation sheet. He ran his finger down the list of cleared checks until he found a payment to Bluegrass Development for $4,500. He turned the page to the photocopy of the check back. It was grainy, black and white, high contrast, but the stamp was legible. For deposit only. River City Bank, Louisville. Account number 884-290-01. Vance stared at the number.
It was a sterile string of digits, but to him it was a lifeline.
River City Bank, Vance said. That's 3 hours away. Sterling drives there every Friday, doesn't he? He leaves at noon. Martha nodded slowly. He says he visits his mother. His mother died in 1978, Martha. Vance took out his notebook. He wrote down the account number. He had the how, the digital transition, the ghost vendor, the suppressed 1991 memo. Now he had the where. He needed to link account number 884-290-01 to Robert Sterling. He looked at the photocopy again. The bank stamp was standard, but there was a faint, handwritten notation above it, likely made by the teller at River City Bank. It was a scribble, barely visible in the grain. Vance took a magnifying glass from his pocket, a habit he never broke, and leaned over the paper.
The scribble wasn't a name. It was a code. DBA, doing business as. And next to it, the teller had written the name of the account holder required for the deposit. It wasn't Robert Sterling. The letters curled in the distinct penmanship of a bank teller in a rush. R.S. Holdings B. Sterling. Vance froze. B. Sterling. Martha, Vance asked, what is Sterling's wife's name? Betty, she said. Elizabeth. Vance exhaled. Sterling hadn't opened the account in his own name. He had used his wife's name, or perhaps she was a willing participant. But it was a direct familial link. He had the money trail. From the taxpayers of Henderson County, through the digital obfuscation of the 1988 patch, into the phantom, quote, 179, quote, and finally landing in a private account in Louisville, controlled by the treasurer's family. Vance closed the binder. The pain in his ribs seemed to recede, replaced by the cold clarity of the solution. We're done here, Martha, Vance said. Lock the door.
Where are you going? She asked, her voice rising in panic. Louisville, Vance said. I have a bank to visit. He picked up the box containing the 1991 memo and the 1988 patch disc. He walked toward the stairs. The soporific hum of the building's ventilation system sounded like a ticking clock. The audit was no longer a review of the past. It was a race against the solvent. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused. He looked at the account number written in his notebook one last time. River City Bank. Account number 884290001. Account holder, Elizabeth Sterling. The theft wasn't just political, it was domestic, and that made it infinitely more volatile. Vance pushed the heavy steel door open, the hinges groaning in the stale air of the basement. He didn't look back at Martha. To look back was to acknowledge the terror radiating off her in waves, and he couldn't afford empathy right now.
Empathy was weight, and he was already carrying too much. The box of evidence in his left hand, the burning agony of a fractured rib in his right side, and the burden of knowing exactly how the county had been gutted from the inside out. He ascended the stairs one by one, measuring his breath. Inhale for 3 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 3. It was a technique he'd learned from a grief counselor after his divorce, designed to quell panic attacks, but he found it worked equally well for suppressing physical pain. The ventilation system continued its rhythmic thrumming, a mechanical lung breathing for a building that had been dead for years. When he reached the ground floor lobby, the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing flicker. The polished terrazzo floor stretched out before him, an expanse of grey speckled with black, like television static frozen in stone. The security desk was empty. Old Man Miller, the regular guard, was likely on his smoke break, huddled under the awning at the back entrance. That was good. Vance didn't want to explain the banker's box tucked under his arm, nor did he want to answer questions about why he looked like he'd gone 10 rounds with a prize fighter. He pushed through the double-glass doors and was immediately assaulted by the humidity. The air outside was thick, heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and looming rain. The sky above Henderson County was a bruised purple, the clouds low and swollen, threatening a storm that had been building all week. It felt appropriate. The pressure in the atmosphere matched the pressure in his skull. Vance moved quickly toward his car, a faded grey sedan that had seen better decades. He unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat,
wincing as the movement twisted his torso. He placed the box on the passenger seat and buckled it in. The evidence, the 5.25-inch floppy disk, the thermal paper memos,
The ledger photocopies, was more valuable than the car itself. It was the only passenger that mattered. He keyed the ignition. The engine turned over with a reluctant cough before settling into a rough idle. Vance checked his rearview mirror. The municipal building stood silent, a concrete block against the darkening sky. No faces in the windows, no sudden movement, just the apathy of government architecture. He threw the car into reverse and pulled out of the lot, his tires crunching over gravel before hitting the paved street. He didn't head straight for the highway. Instead, he took a series of left turns, winding through the residential streets of the town. He watched his mirrors religiously. A blue pickup truck turned 2 blocks behind him. Vance sped up, took a sharp right, then a quick left. The truck didn't follow. Just traffic. Just paranoia. But in his line of work, paranoia was just a heightened state of awareness. As he merged onto the on-ramp for Interstate 65, the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the windshield. He flipped on the wipers. Thwack, hiss. Thwack, hiss. The rhythm became the metronome for his thoughts. Elizabeth Sterling. The name rolled around in his mind, gathering weight. Robert Sterling was a brute force instrument, a man of handshakes, backslapping, and loud intimidation. He was the kind of man who thought he could bully numbers into submission. But he wasn't subtle. The 1988 patch was a clumsy tool, a digital sledgehammer used to smash the accounting system. It left debris. But Elizabeth? Betty? Vance tried to conjure an image of her. He'd seen her briefly at the Founders' Day parade 3 years ago. She was a woman who wore pearls to a barbecue, her hair sprayed into a helmet of perfection, her smile tight and practiced. She was the treasurer's wife, the first lady of county finance. She was the one who organized the charity drives and sat on the library board. And she was the one laundering stolen tax dollars through a DBA account in Louisville. Why her? The interstate stretched out before him, a grey ribbon cutting through the rolling green hills of Kentucky. The rain intensified, blurring the taillights of the semi-trucks ahead into red streaks. Vance kept his speed steady, 5 miles above the limit, fast enough to make time, slow enough to avoid the state troopers who liked to camp out near the way stations. He thought about the dynamics of a marriage built on fraud. Was she a victim? A wife coerced into signing papers she didn't understand? That was the defense lawyer's narrative.
Your Honor, my client is a simple housewife who trusted her husband.
Vance gripped the steering wheel tighter. The DBA notation suggested otherwise. R.S. Holdings. That wasn't just a signature, that was an active participation in the creation of a shell entity. You didn't accidentally file a doing business as form. You had to go to the county clerk, likely in a different county to avoid recognition, fill out the paperwork, pay the fee, and present identification. Then you had to take that registration to a bank and open a commercial account. Betty Sterling wasn't a victim. She was the bagman. The realization made Vance's stomach churn. It complicated everything. If he went after Robert Sterling, he was attacking a politician. That was sport. But going after the wife? That was war. Sterling would burn the county to the ground to protect her, or, and this was the darker thought, he would throw her to the wolves to save himself. Vance had seen both happen. He wasn't sure which was worse. The drive to Louisville was a blur of grey rain and grey thoughts. The pain in his ribs settled into a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the encounter in the file room 2 days prior. He reached into his jacket pocket and dry swallowed 2 ibuprofen, chasing them with the sour taste of bile. By the time the skyline of Louisville emerged from the mist, it was late afternoon. The city felt like a different planet compared to the stagnant quiet of Henderson. Here the buildings scraped the sky, glass and steel reflecting the storm clouds. Traffic thickened, a river of metal flowing toward the bridges crossing the Ohio River. Vance navigated the downtown grid with muscle memory. He knew this city, he knew its shadows. River City Bank was located on Main Street, in the historic district where the facades were cast iron and the money was old.
It wasn't one of the new, flash-in-the-pan commercial banks with neon signs and free toasters. River City Bank was mahogany desks, green bankers' lamps, and silence.
It was the kind of place where you didn't ask questions because you already knew the answers. He found a parking garage 2 blocks away. He pulled a ticket, the gate arm rising like a salute. He parked on the 3rd level, backing into a space near the stairwell. Tactical parking. Always be ready to leave. He killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in his ears. He looked at the box on the passenger seat. He couldn't take it in with him. It was too conspicuous. He opened the glove compartment and took out a smaller, leather-bound portfolio. He transferred the photocopy of the deposit slip and the page from his notebook with the account number into the portfolio. He locked the floppy disk in the glove box. He stepped out of the car, the damp air of the parking garage smelling of oil and urine. He buttoned his trench coat, hiding the coffee stain on his shirt and the bruise blossoming on his side. He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to look less like a fugitive and more like a man with financial business. The walk to the bank was short. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, coating the cobblestone streets in a slick sheen. Vance checked his watch. 3:45 p.m. The bank closed at 5 on Fridays. He had an hour and 15 minutes to bluff his way into the vault of truth. The entrance to River City Bank was a set of heavy brass doors flanked by marble columns. Vance pushed through, stepping onto a plush crimson carpet that swallowed the sound of his wet shoes. The interior was cathedral-like, high vaulted ceilings, chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow, and a row of tellers behind thick glass partitions. To the right, a series of oak desks sat behind a velvet rope, the loan officers and branch managers. Vance bypassed the teller line. He wasn't here to make a deposit. He walked straight to the velvet rope and unhooked it. A young woman at the first desk looked up startled. She wore a silk blouse and an expression of polite gatekeeping. Vance said, his voice low and authoritative. He flipped open his wallet, flashing his state auditor's badge. It was a flimsy piece of metal, but in the right light and with the right attitude, it looked like federal authority. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting from the badge to Vance's face. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the set of his jaw. She decided he wasn't a crazy person, just a serious one. He added the last part. It wasn't a real department, but it sounded terrifying. "One moment, Mr. Vance." She picked up her phone, pressed a button, and whispered into the receiver. She nodded twice, hung up, and stood. "Mr. Galloway will see you. His office is in the back." She pointed toward a frosted glass door at the far end of the lobby. Vance nodded a curt thanks and marched toward the office. He could feel eyes on him, the security guard near the vault, the tellers pausing in their counting. He kept his gaze forward. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside. Mr. Galloway was a man who looked like he had been manufactured by the bank itself. He was 60, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Vance's car. He was standing behind a massive desk, arranging papers. He looked up, his smile professional but guarded. Vance said, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He walked to the desk and placed the leather portfolio on the polished wood. "And frankly, given what I've found, you should be glad I came to you before I went to the FBI." Galloway's smile faltered. The mention of the FBI had the desired effect. The blood drained slightly from his face. I don't understand. River City Bank is fully compliant with all state and federal regulations." "I'm sure the bank is," Vance lied. "But your clients? That's a different story." Vance opened the portfolio. He slid the photocopy of the deposit slip across the desk. It was grainy, but the account number was legible, as was the faint DBA scrawl. "Account 884-290-01, Vance recited from memory. "Opened roughly 3 years ago. Steady deposits every month. Always just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. Structuring. That's a federal crime, Mr. Galloway. Money laundering." Galloway picked up the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He adjusted his spectacles. "I don't recognize this account offhand, Mr. Vance. We have thousands of customers." "You'll recognize this one," Vance said, "because the deposits are coming from a vendor that doesn't exist, paid for by the taxpayers of Henderson County, and the beneficiary is the wife of a sitting county treasurer. Galloway looked up, his eyes widening. Henderson County? That's 3 hours away, Vance finished. A long drive to make a deposit, unless you're trying to hide where the money is going. Vance leaned over the desk, ignoring the sharp stab of pain in his ribs. He needed to dominate this space. I need the signature card, Galloway. I need the articles of incorporation for RS Holdings. And I need a transaction history for the last 24 months. Galloway set the paper down. He regained some of his composure. Mr. Vance, surely you understand privacy laws. I cannot simply hand over client data without a subpoena or a warrant, even to a state auditor.
I can get a warrant, Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I can have a judge sign one in an hour. But if I do that, the police come with me. The press comes with me. And tomorrow morning the headline isn't "Corrupt Treasurer Caught." It's "River City Bank Facilitates Political Theft." How does that look for your quarterly earnings? Galloway stared at him. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Vance held the stare. He was bluffing on the timeline. Getting a warrant on a Friday afternoon in a different jurisdiction would take all weekend, but Galloway didn't know that. Galloway saw a man in a trench coat who looked like he had nothing left to lose. Galloway stammered. Vance said. Galloway sat down at his computer. He typed rapidly, his eyes scanning the monitor. Vance moved around the desk to stand behind him. The screen flickered blue. Galloway entered the account number. 88429001. Enter. A profile loaded. Account name, RS Holdings. DBA, Elizabeth Ann Sterling. Home branch, Louisville, Maine. Vance breathed. Galloway said, pointing at the screen. Vance noted. Galloway hit a key. A waterfall of numbers scrolled down the screen. Deposit, $8,500. Bluegrass Dev. Deposit, $9. $200. Bluegrass Dev. Deposit, $7,800. Bluegrass Dev. Vance said. Galloway said, leaning closer to the screen. Vance squinted. The deposits were consistent, but the withdrawals were erratic, large cash withdrawals. Checks written to... Vance asked, pointing to a recurring payee. Galloway said. He clicked on the check image for the most recent withdrawal. The digital image of the check popped up. Pay to the order of LV Construction. Amount, $15,000. Signed by Elizabeth Sterling. But it was the endorsement on the back of the check that stopped Vance's heart. It wasn't a business stamp. It was a handwritten signature. A scrawl he had seen 1,000 times on county memos, on interdepartmental complaints, on the bottom of his own paychecks. Lyle Vance. Vance recoiled as if the screen had burned him. No, he whispered. That's impossible. You know this person? Galloway asked, looking up. Vance stared at the signature. It was his name, but it wasn't his signature. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but enough to pass a tired teller's glance. LV Construction, Vance muttered. Lyle Vance. The room spun. The framing wasn't just about stealing money. It was about creating a fall guy. They had set up a shell company using his name. They were funneling the stolen money into an account that looked like it belonged to him. If anyone audited the Sterlings, they would point to the withdrawals. We didn't keep the money, officer. We were being extorted by the auditor. Look, here are the checks made out to him. Mr. Vance? Galloway's voice sounded far away. Are you all right? You look pale. Vance gripped the edge of the desk. The pain in his ribs flared into a supernova. The sheer malice of it. It wasn't enough to steal. They had to prepare a sacrificial lamb. And who better than the auditor who asked too many questions? The lonely, divorced, drinking auditor with a bruised reputation. Vance said, his voice ragged. Vance looked at Galloway. The bluff was over. He needed an ally, and he needed one fast. Galloway stood up, alarmed by the shift in Vance's demeanor. If you're involved in this... I'm the victim, you idiot, Vance snapped. Don't you see? They're using my name to wash the money out of the wife's account. If I don't walk out of here with proof that I didn't sign those checks, I'm going to prison. Galloway hesitated. He looked at the desperate man in front of him, then back at the screen. He saw the forgery. He saw the irregularity. He was a banker, and bankers hated messiness. This was messy.
"I can print the transaction record," Galloway said slowly, "and I can give you copies of the cashed checks. But I need you to sign an affidavit stating you are requesting these as part of an official investigation."
"I'll sign whatever you want," Vance said. "Just print it." The dot matrix printer in the corner whirred to life. Zip, 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 zip. The sound was agonizingly slow. Vance paced the small office. He checked the window. The street below was dark now, the streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. He looked at the car parked across the street. A black Lincoln town car, tinted windows. It was idling. Vance froze. He moved to the side of the window, peering through the blinds. The Lincoln sat there, exhaust puffing into the cool air.
It hadn't been there when he walked in. Vance said, his voice tight. Galloway handed him a stack of warm paper. Vance said. He shoved the papers into his portfolio. The evidence in the car, the disc, was vulnerable. But he had the paper trail now. He had the proof of the frame-up. Vance told Galloway. Vance didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his portfolio and bolted from the office. He bypassed the lobby, sprinting, or moving as fast as his broken ribs would allow, toward the sign marked Employees Only. He burst into the break room, startling a janitor mopping the floor. "Excuse me," Vance gasped, pushing past him to the steel door at the rear. He hit the crash bar and stumbled out into the alley. It was dark, smelling of wet cardboard and rotting garbage. The rain had started again, a cold drizzle. Vance pressed his back against the brick wall, trying to orient himself. His car was in the garage a block over. The Lincoln was out front. If Sterling's people were here, they knew he was inside. They must have tracked the car. Or maybe Martha. No, he wouldn't let himself think that. Martha was scared, not treacherous. Vance took a step toward the street, staying in the shadows. He needed to get to the garage. He needed to get to a phone booth that wasn't tapped. He needed to call the one person in the state attorney's office he still trusted. But first, he had to survive the walk. He hugged his portfolio to his chest, shielding it from the rain. The numbers on those pages were his death warrant, or his salvation. LV Construction. The anger flared again, hot and bright, burning through the pain. They thought he was a drunk. They thought he was a has-been. They thought he was a patsy. Vance stepped out of the alley and into the rain. He wasn't just an auditor anymore. He was the glitch in their system, and he was about to crash the whole damn program. He moved toward the parking garage, his eyes scanning the rooftops, the parked cars, the shadows between streetlights. The city was a maze, and the Minotaur was Robert Sterling. But Vance had the thread, and he was going to pull it until the whole labyrinth unraveled. Vance slotted a quarter into the payphone receiver, the metal cold and slick against his thumb. The booth, located 3 streets away from the county administration building, offered a fractured view of the intersection through graffiti-scratched plexiglass. He dialed the number for David Hewen, the assistant state attorney, from memory. It rang 4 times before Hewen picked up, his voice thick with sleep. "Hello? It's Vance. I need you to meet me at the Holiday Inn on Route 60. Room 112. Bring a tape recorder and a subpoena template." "Arthur? It's 11 o'clock at night. What's going on?" "I have the ledger sheets for LV Construction," Vance said, watching a patrol car cruise slowly past the mouth of the alley. He turned his back to the street, hunched over the receiver. "And I know where the money went. If we don't move on the physical records by morning, Sterling is going to shred everything left in the building." "Are you safe?" "I'm at a payphone. Just get to the hotel, David. We have to build the timeline before the banks open." Vance hung up without waiting for confirmation. He returned to his car, a nondescript sedan parked in the shadows of a closed muffler shop, and placed the portfolio on the passenger seat. He didn't drive immediately. He sat for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof, his breathing steadying into the rhythm of a man about to undertake a long, tedious task. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, replaced by the cold clarity of the accountant. He drove to the motel, checking his rearview mirror every 2 blocks. By midnight, the small round table in room 112 was covered in paper. David Hewen sat on the edge of the bed, tie loosened, reading through the photocopies Vance had secured. The room smelled of stale carpet and fresh coffee. Hewan muttered, rubbing his eyes. Vance said. He was seated at the table, aligning a stack of green bar computer printouts with a ruler. 269, Vance said. Hewan noted. Vance said. He tapped the paper with his pen. Hewan leaned in. Hewan said. Vance agreed. The next morning broke grey and humid. Vance and Hewan arrived at the county clerk's office at 8 a.m. sharp, accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers. The building was quiet, the air conditioning humming a low, monotonous drone. They bypassed the front counter and went straight to Martha Jenkins' office. Martha was standing by the filing cabinet, holding a watering can over a fern that had long since died. She froze when Vance entered. She looked at the officers, then at Vance. Her face was pale, the skin around her eyes tight with exhaustion. "Martha," Vance said softly. He closed the door, leaving the officers in the hallway. "It's over." She set the watering can down. Her hands were shaking. "I didn't take a dime, Mr. Vance. You have to believe me. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. I drive a 10-year-old Honda." "I know you didn't take the money," Vance said, "but you watched it go, and you signed the reconciliation reports that said the accounts were balanced." "He told me it was a temporary loan," she whispered, sinking into her chair. "Back in '88, he said he was in a hole with some people in Lexington. Gambling debts. He said he'd put it back before the fiscal year closed. But then the virus hit the system." "There was no virus, Martha," Vance said. He pulled a chair opposite her. "That was a cover story to wipe the transition logs." She looked up, tears welling. "He made me install the patch. He said it was from the vendor, a security update." "We'll get to the patch," Vance said. "Right now, I need to know where the physical books are, the ones from the basement, the ones you moved last night." Martha's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Because you're meticulous, Martha. You wouldn't destroy a public record, even if it incriminated your boss. It goes against your nature. You move them to keep them safe, or to keep them as leverage." She stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching, filled only by the hum of the ventilation. Then, slowly, she reached into her purse. She withdrew a small brass key with a yellow plastic tag. "You store it on 4th Street, she said, her voice barely audible. "Unit 404. It's all there, the duplicate ledgers he kept for himself, the real numbers." Vance took the key. It was warm from her hand. "Thank you, Martha." The recovery of the materials from Unit 404 shifted the investigation from speculative to forensic. The unit was stacked floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes, each labelled in Sterling's own handwriting. While Hewan began the process of obtaining an arrest warrant for Robert Sterling, Vance arranged for the boxes to be transported to a secure conference room in the state attorney's building. Thus began the 48-hour reconciliation. Vance requested complete isolation. He had the boxes arranged chronologically along the length of a 20-foot mahogany table. On a separate desk, he set up his own computer terminal and a stack of fresh ledger paper. He started with 1983. The work was slow, a rhythmic process of cross-referencing. He would pick up a receipt stub from a box, a yellowed slip of carbon paper representing a land sale or a tax collection, and verify it against the shadow book found in the storage unit. Then, he would compare that entry to the official county report filed with the state. Hour 1. Vance identified the first discrepancy, a land transfer fee of $4,500, recorded in the shadow book, missing from the official report. Hour 4. The pattern established itself, small amounts initially, under $5,000, always in cash transactions or bearer bonds. By hour 12, Vance had reached 1988. This was the critical juncture. This was where the paper trail ended and the digital deception began. He opened the box marked 1988, System Transition. Inside, alongside the printouts, was a floppy disk labeled Update v2.1. Vance inserted the disk into his terminal. He wasn't a programmer, but he understood logic flows. He accessed the file directory. The code was compiled, but there was a README file. Instruction: run upon boot. Disables secondary authentication for user ID. treasurer. It wasn't a virus, it was a toggle switch. The patch had modified the accounting software to allow the treasurer account to authorize transfers without a second digital signature from the clerk. It effectively removed Martha Jenkins from the loop digitally, while the physical paperwork still required her sign-off, paperwork that Sterling had simply stopped generating. Vance poured his fifth cup of coffee. The room was silent, save for the scratching of his pen and the click of the keyboard. He was building a bridge across time, connecting the manual thefts of the early 80s to the automated siphoning of the 90s. He found the virus report in the official files. It was dated November 1988. System crash due to external malware. Data corruption in accounts receivable. Estimated loss of records, 3 months. Vance cross-referenced the shadow book for those 3 months. The records weren't lost. They were hiding. In that 3-month window, $140,000 had been transferred to Bluegrass Development. The quote, 301, was simply the excuse used to manually adjust the starting balance of the new digital ledger, forcing it to agree with the bank statement while erasing the history of the theft. It was accounting alchemy. Sterling had turned a deficit into a balanced book by simply deleting the obligation to pay. Vance worked through the night. His eyes burned and his back ached from the rigid posture, but he did not stop. He was entering a trance state, where the numbers ceased to be abstract values and became a narrative. He could see the desperation in the acceleration of the theft. 1990, $50,000 withdrawn. 1991, $120,000. 1992, $240,000. The gambling debts were compounding. Sterling wasn't stealing to get rich anymore, he was stealing to survive. The loans were never repaid. By the morning of the second day, Vance had reached the present. He printed the final summary. He stapled the sheets together, the sound of the stapler echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. Total diverted funds, $1,244,560.23. He picked up the phone and dialed Hewen. "It's done. I have the number." The grand jury convened 3 weeks later. The proceedings were closed to the public, but the atmosphere in the hallway was electric. Robert Sterling had arrived with a high-priced defense attorney from Louisville, wearing a suit that cost more than Vance's car. Sterling looked confident, smiling for the local press, shaking hands. He was betting on the complexity of the case. He was betting that a jury of laypeople would glaze over when faced with 10 years of amortization schedules and software logs. He hadn't counted on the charts. Vance stood before the grand jury, an easel set up beside the witness stand. He didn't use jargon. He didn't talk about amortization. Vance said to the jurors, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. He flipped the chart. It showed a simple diagram. The jurors nodded. They understood buckets. Vance said, he placed the shadow book on the evidence table. He presented the LV construction checks. He presented the Bluegrass Development bank records, which Hewen had subpoenaed. Then came the software patch. Vance held up the floppy disk. He held it up. Sterling's lawyer tried to object, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, that the logs could have been manipulated. Hewen interjected. Sterling's confidence evaporated. He slumped in his chair, the smile gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. The indictment was handed down in less than an hour. 24 counts of embezzlement, 12 counts of fraud, and 6 counts of official misconduct. The plea bargain came 2 months later. In exchange for a reduced sentence, 12 years instead of 20, Sterling agreed to full liquidation of his assets. The forensic accounting phase shifted to asset recovery. This was the final grinding phase of the audit. Vance worked with federal marshals to catalogue everything Sterling owned. The house on the lake, appraised at $450,000. The collection of vintage cars, auctioned for $210,000. The undeclared cash in the safe deposit box, $85,000. The remaining funds in the Bluegrass Development account, $55,000. 000. Vance stood in the driveway of Sterling's estate as the auctioneers loaded the last of the furniture. It was a sunny day in late autumn. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, a stark contrast to the stark white of the inventory tags on every item. Hewen walked up the driveway, holding a clipboard. Hewen said. Vance said. Hewen added. Vance said. He watched a grand piano being hoisted into a truck. Vance said. Vance returned to his office in the basement of the state capitol. The excitement was over. The reporters had moved on to a murder trial in Lexington. The lawyers were filing their closing briefs. Vance sat at his desk, the fluorescent light humming above him. He had the total seizure amount on a slip of paper. $800,000 recovered. $444, $560.23 confirmed loss to gambling institutions, unrecoverable. He opened the final ledger. Total theft, $1,244,560.23. Total recovered plus total dissipated, $1,244,560.23. Vance punched the numbers into his adding machine. The tape spooled out with a satisfying chunk, chunk, chunk. He tore off the strip of paper. 0.00. The variance was 0. Every penny was accounted for. The equation was balanced. Vance picked up his pen and signed the bottom of the page. He closed the folder, turned off the light, and walked out of the office, leaving the darkness and the silence behind him. The Henderson County Land Trust audit was closed. The final audit report total matched exactly with the personal assets seized from the primary suspect. For a long time, Arthur Vance sat in his sedan in the designated state employee parking lot. The engine was cold, the radio silent. Rain had begun to fall, a slow, insistent drizzle that blurred the dome of the state capitol building through his windshield, turning the seat of government into a grey, indistinct smudge. It was over. The phrase repeated in his mind, synchronized with the rhythmic thrum of the wipers he finally engaged. It is over. But the satisfaction that usually accompanied the closing of a binder, the tactile snap of the metal rings locking away a chaotic mess of numbers into a coherent narrative, was absent. Instead, a peculiar numbness had settled in his chest, heavy and cold, like a stone dropped into a deep well. He put the car in gear and drove out of the lot, tires hissing on the wet asphalt. He navigated the winding streets of Frankfurt, passing the old brick facades of the administrative buildings, the diner where he ate his turkey club every Tuesday, the dry cleaners where they knew not to starch his collars. It was a life of meticulous routine, one he had neglected for 6 months while chasing the ghost of Sterling's greed through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. He arrived at his apartment complex, a nondescript brick building on the edge of town that catered to civil servants and divorcees. His unit was on the 2nd floor. It smelled of stale air and the lemon-scented cleaner the housekeeping service used on Fridays. Vance placed his briefcase on the dining table, the only table he used, and loosened his tie. He went to the kitchen, poured a glass of tap water, and drank it standing over the sink. He looked out the window at the parking lot below, watching the streetlights flicker on, casting long amber shadows across the wet pavement. 0.00. The number flashed in his mind's eye, neon bright. He walked into the living room and sat in his armchair, staring at the blank television screen. He didn't turn it on. He simply sat, replaying the sequence of the afternoon, the auction tags fluttering in the wind, the sound of the piano leg scraping against the truck ramp, Hewen's relief, the reconciliation sheet. Total theft, $1,244,560.23. Total recovered plus dissipated, $1,244,560.23. It was the .23 that began to itch. Vance closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the ledger pages floated. He visualized the columns, the dates, the seizure orders. Asset valuations were fluid. That was the first rule of liquidation. A house appraised at $450,000 might sell for $420,000
or $460,000, depending on the market, the weather, or the mood of the bidders. The vintage cars, a Jaguar E-Type, a customized Corvette, a pristine Mercedes SL, were even more volatile. Their value was subjective, determined by the whim of collectors on a specific Tuesday in October. Yet, the equation had balanced. Vance sat forward, the leather of the chair creaking. The amount Sterling had stolen, the total theft, was a historical fact.
It was a fixed sum, an aggregate of checks forged, funds diverted, and accounts skimmed over a period of 3 years. That number, $1,244,560.23, had been established by the forensic audit 3 months ago. It was immutable. It was written in stone before the first gavel fell at the auction. So how was it possible, statistically, mathematically, cosmically, that the variable, unpredictable sum of the liquidated assets, plus the cash found in the safe, plus the exact amount of verified gambling losses, summed up to equal the theft to the penny? If the house had sold for $1,000 less, there would have been a variance. If the Jaguar had gone for $500 more, there would have been a variance. If Sterling had bet $10 more on a hand of blackjack before he was arrested, there would have been a variance. But there was no variance. The perfection was impossible. In 20 years of forensic auditing, Vance had never seen a zero variance in a forfeiture case. There was always a remainder, a few $1,000s unrecovered, or a surplus from an asset selling above expectations that had to be returned to the general fund. The probability of the liquidation proceeds matching the theft exactly was akin to dropping a handful of sand and having it land in the shape of a perfect pyramid. Vance stood up. The numbness in his chest was gone, replaced by a sharp, vibrating tension. He paced the small length of his living room. Someone worked the numbers backward. It was the only explanation. The total theft figure hadn't been fixed 3 months ago. It had been adjusted. Someone had waited until the auction was over, until the cash was counted, and until the casino reports were finalized. Then, they had tailored the theft amount to match the recovery, ensuring the case closed cleanly. But why? To lower the theft amount? If Sterling had stolen $2 million, but they only recovered 1.2, showing a loss of $800,000, would look bad for the county. It would imply negligence. But if they adjusted the quote 327 down to match the quote 328, it looked like a perfect victory for justice. Or was it the other way around? Did they inflate the theft to match a higher recovery? Unlikely. Vance looked at his briefcase. The file was officially closed. He had signed it. The governor was likely drafting a press release praising the efficiency of the Henderson County reclamation. He checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. He grabbed his keys. The state capitol was a different beast at night, the marble hallways, usually echoing with the click of heels and the murmur of lobbyists, were tomb-like. The air conditioning hummed a low, industrial bass note. Vance swiped his badge at the security turnstile. The night guard, a heavy-set man named Miller, who was reading a paperback western, barely looked up. 29. Vance said, "Why do you unopen my marm?" Vance, "Know how the released is open by the truth. Quiet me, the garden's coming up through the Atha to the second. It was whether they the help the different flight." Vance took at the world clived, the depth through the rush of them. The size of them was no, and work the small that they was Vance. The basement was a labyrinth of file storage, server rooms, and the cramped offices assigned to the Department of Auditor of Public Accounts. He walked to his door, the frosted glass glowing faintly from the hallway light. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and flipped the switch. The office was exactly as he had left it, stark, austere, smelling of ozone and old paper. The adding machine sat on the desk, the strip of tape with the 0.00 still curling from its mouth like a dead tongue. Vance sat down and pulled the thick banker's box labelled Sterling, J. Henderson Trust, from the floor. He heaved it onto the desk. He needed to find the original theft calculation, the one he had generated 3 months ago. He began to sort through the files. Bank statements from Bluegrass Development, cancelled checks from the Land Trust, invoices for, quote,
333 quote that never happened. He found his preliminary working paper, dated August 14th. He ran his finger down the column. Total estimated misappropriation, $1,450,000, approximately. Quote, 3333 3333 3 3330 34,000. Quote, train per 33 point, 33343. Total estimated misappropriation, $1,450,000, approximate. For Thirst 1, tray 23, 33 quote. Vance whispered. That was standard. They knew Sterling was bleeding the accounts, but the exact flow was muddy. He dug deeper, looking for the quote 335 document, the one that usually locked the theft amount in place for the prosecutors. He found it, dated September 2nd. Confirmed theft, $1,244.
560.23. Vance frowned. The date was September 2nd. The auction of the house and cars hadn't happened until October 15th. The gambling loss confirmation from the casinos arrived on November 1st. If the theft number was fixed on September 2nd and the recovery numbers were fluid until November, the match was a coincidence of astronomical proportions. Unless... Vance pulled the gambling file. The Golden Horseshoe Casino, Indiana. Patron history, Sterling, James. The printout was on thermal paper, curling at the edges. It listed dates, buy-ins and cash-outs. The bottom line read, net loss, $444,560.23. Vance stared at the number, $444,560.23. He pulled the auction report. House, $450,000. Cars, $210,000. Cash, $85,000. Funds, $55,000. Total liquid assets, $800,000. $800,000 assets, plus $444,560.23, gambling loss, equals $1,244,560.23. The math worked. But the logic didn't. The gambling loss had the same decimal ending as the total theft, 0.23 cents. That meant the $800,000 in assets was a clean, round number. Vance looked at the auction receipts again. Lot 4A, lakefront property, final bid, $450,000. Lot 7B, 1965 Jaguar, final bid, $82,500. Lot 7C, 1970 Corvette, final bid, $65,000. Lot 7D, 1988 Mercedes, final bid, $62,500. He grabbed his calculator. 82,500 plus 65,000 plus 62,500 equals $210,000. Clean numbers, round numbers. In an auction, where fees are calculated, where taxes are assessed? He looked closer at the auctioneer's settlement sheet. Buyer's premium, waived. Transfer tax, paid by seller, estate. Vance muttered, auction houses never waived the premium. That was their profit margin, usually 10 to 15%. He looked at the buyer for the house. Bluegrass Holdings, LLC. He looked at the buyer for the cars. Bluegrass Holdings, LLC. Vance felt a chill crawl up his neck. Bluegrass Development was Sterling's shell company, the one he used to steal the money. Bluegrass Holdings was a different name, but the cadence was suspiciously similar. He turned to his computer. It was an beige tower that wheezed when he pressed the power button. He waited for the CRT monitor to warm up, the familiar Windows logo appearing through the static. He logged into the Secretary of State's business entity search. He typed in Bluegrass Holdings, LLC. Status, active. Incorporated, October 10th, 5 days before the auction. Registered agent, C. Hewen. Vance froze. Charles Hewen. The man who had walked up the driveway with the clipboard. The man who had told him to take a vacation. The assistant attorney general overseeing the forfeiture. Vance sat back, his breath shallow. Hewen had incorporated a shell company. Hewen had used that company to buy Sterling's assets at the auction, and because Hewen controlled the auction parameters, he ensured the bids were nice, round numbers that, when combined with the gambling losses, would create a narrative of total restitution. But why buy the assets? Why not just sell them to the public? Because the assets were worth more. Vance grabbed the appraisal report for the house, dated 6 months prior. Appraised value, $850,000. The house sold for $450,000. The cars. The Jaguar alone was worth $150,000 in this market, sold for $82,500. It was a fire sale, a rigged liquidation. Hewen had sold the assets to himself, hidden behind an LLC, for pennies on the dollar. He used the quote 337 quote money to satisfy the audit, claiming the rest was lost to gambling. But wait, if Hewen bought the assets for $800,000, where did he get the $800?
000 to buy them. He couldn't use state money to buy state-seized assets. That would be a circle. Vance looked at the undeclared cash report. $85,000 found in the safe, and the remaining funds in the Bluegrass Development account, $55,000. He went back to the gambling report. Net loss, $444,560.23. This was the linchpin. If this number was fake, the whole equation collapsed. Vance picked up the phone. He dialed the number for the Gaming Commission liaison, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who usually took his calls, even late. "Audit," a tired voice answered. "Sarah, it's Arthur Vance." "Arthur? Jesus, it's 9 o'clock. Don't you ever sleep? I thought you closed Henderson." "I did. I am. I need a verification on a patron history report. Can you pull it up remotely?" "Technically, no. Practically, give me the ID."
Sterling, James, the Golden Horseshoe. I have a report here that says verified losses of $444,560.23. Hold on. I have to log into the Interstate Compact server. It's slow. Vance waited. He heard the clicking of keys on the other end. He stared at the name C. Hewen on his screen. "Okay," Sarah said. "I've got Sterling. He was a regular, all right. Loves the slots. What's the total lifetime loss? Lifetime? Or the audit period?" "The audit period, January 1st through seizure." "Okay, calculating. Here we go. Total buy-in, $600,000. Total cash-out, $598,000. Vance gripped the phone. "Say that again." "He broke even, mostly. Lost about $2,000. Wait, let me check the comp balance. Yeah, he was a washer, Arthur. He put money in, played a few hands, and cashed out to clean the bills. But he didn't lose $500,000. Where did you get that number?"
"I'm looking at a printout on Golden Horseshoe letterhead," Vance said quietly.
"Well, it's forged," Sarah said, her voice sharpening. "Or it's a theoretical loss report, not actual. But even then, Arthur, the database shows he walked away with nearly everything he walked in with." "Thanks, Sarah. Don't log this inquiry. Arthur, what's going on?" "Good night, Sarah." Vance hung up. The picture was forming, ugly and sharp. Sterling hadn't lost the money. He had laundered it. The $444,000 was likely sitting in a clean account somewhere, or... No, Hewen. Hewen needed the quote 361 to match the quote 362 to close the case. If the real recovery was low, because Hewen bought the assets cheap, he needed a large quote 363 amount to balance the ledger against the total theft. So Hewen forged the gambling report. He created a quote 364 of $444,000 that never happened. This allowed him to say, quote 365. The state thinks the money is gone. Sterling is in jail. Or dead. Vance realized he hadn't checked Sterling's current status recently. Hewen owns a lake house and a fleet of vintage cars worth double what he paid for them. But where was the actual missing cash?
the $444,000 that Sterling didn't lose. If Hewen forged the report to cover the gap, the real money was still out there. Vance looked at the recovered cash again. $85,000.
He realized he was looking at the wrong side of the equation.
The $1.2 million theft was real. Sterling stole it. He washed $600,000 at the casino and kept it. He bought the house and cars with the rest. When the state seized the assets, Hewen saw an opportunity. 1. Suppress the value of the assets. 2. Buy them himself through a shell company. 3. Forge a gambling loss document to explain why the total recovery was so low compared to the theft. 4. Pocket the difference? No, the difference is the assets. But what about the cash Sterling washed? The $600,000 Sarah mentioned.
If Sterling cashed out $598,000, that money wasn't in the safe. Only $85,000 was in the safe.
Where was the other $500,000?
Vance whispered.
Vance stood up. He grabbed the Hewen file, or rather the file he was about to create for Hewen. He took the forged gambling report. He took the printout of the Bluegrass Holdings registration. He needed the physical evidence. The gambling report in the file was a photocopy. He needed to know if the original was ever filed, or if Hewen had slipped the photocopy in before handing the box to Vance. He looked at the shelf where the logs were kept. Every piece of evidence seized from Sterling's estate had to be tagged and logged by the state police before being turned over to the auditors. Vance walked to the metal shelves. He found the logbook for case 24-909, Henderson Trust. He flipped to the page dated November 1st. Item 404.
Sealed envelope from Golden Horseshoe Casino. Wrecked by Lieutenant Miller. Relinquished to C. Hewen.
Hewen had intercepted the casino mail. He had swapped the report. Vance felt a surge of adrenaline that made his hands shake. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was obstruction of justice, forgery, and grand larceny by a state official. He couldn't go to the police. The state police worked closely with the Attorney General's office. Hewen likely had friends there.
He couldn't go to the governor. The governor was campaigning on the success of the, quote, 370, quote. He had to go to the only entity that cared more about money than politics. The insurance company. The Henderson County Land Trust was bonded. Fidelity and Deposit of Maryland held the surety bond on the trust officers. They had paid out a claim to the county for the initial loss. They would be very interested to know that the assets were undervalued and that $500,000 in cash was missing, not lost. Vance packed his briefcase. He took the critical documents. He left the box on the desk, but arranged the remaining files to look undisturbed. He turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. "Miller?" the guard asked as Vance approached the turnstile. Vance said, keeping his face neutral. Miller chuckled. Vance said, pushing through the gate. The rain had intensified. Vance drove to a 24-hour copy center 3 towns over, in Georgetown. He didn't trust the machines in the capital. He made 3 sets of copies. One set went into a padded envelope addressed to the Claims Department of Fidelity and Deposit in Baltimore. The second set went into a locker at the Greyhound bus station in Lexington. The third set stayed in his briefcase. He didn't go home. He drove to a Motel 6 off the interstate. He paid cash. He sat on the lumpy mattress, the neon sign outside buzzing in a rhythm that competed with the rain. He spread the papers out on the bedspread. He needed to prove Hewen had the missing cash. The assets were easy to prove. The LLC registration was a smoking gun. But the cash, if Hewen had seized $600,000 from Sterling's hideout and only reported $85,000, that money was likely physical cash. Sterling was a gambler. He wouldn't have kept the washed money in a bank. He would have kept it in a safe. The inventory said, 1. Liberty safe, combination locked. Contents, $85,000 US dollars, mixed denominations. Who opened the safe? Vance checked the seizure report copy. Safe opened by C. Hewen, AAG, and Sergeant K. Davis, KSP. Sergeant Davis. Vance knew him. A younger trooper, eager, a bit naive. If Hewen had pocketed $500,000 in front of him, Davis was either in on it or Hewen had sent him out of the room.
Vance looked at the time. 2 a.m.
He couldn't call Davis now. He lay back on the bed, staring at the popcorn ceiling. The Huon had mentioned it proudly. Mandatory external audits. No more self-policing. It was the perfect cover. Pass a law that looks tough on crime while you're committing the crime. It made Huon look like a crusader. Vance realized with a sinking feeling that he had been the tool. Huon had picked him for the audit. Huon knew Vance was meticulous. Yes, but Huon also knew Vance was an introvert who trusted the paper. Vance looked for mathematical errors, not conspiracies. If the numbers balanced, Vance stopped digging. Huon had given him a balanced equation. He had handed Vance the zero variance on a silver platter, knowing Vance would accept it as the holy grail of auditing. Vance whispered to the empty room. The anger was different now. It wasn't the abstract offense of theft. It was personal. Huon had used Vance's own integrity as a weapon against the truth. Vance slept for 3 hours, a fitful, shallow rest, filled with dreams of columns that wouldn't add up. He woke at 5:30 a.m. He showered, put on the same suit, and went to the Waffle House across the street. He ordered black coffee and toast. While he ate, he formulated a plan. He needed to verify the value of the assets. He needed to see the house and the cars. The house was on Lake Barkley, a 3-hour drive. The cars. The auction report said they were, quote, 379 delivery to Bluegrass Holdings. He needed to find where Bluegrass Holdings was located. The Secretary of State listing had an address. 1400 Willow Drive, Suite 202, Lexington. Vance finished his coffee, left a tip that was exactly 15%, and got back in his car. 1400 Willow Drive was a strip mall. Suite 202 was a mailbox rental store called, quote, 380. Vance sat at the Medifet, was the 20 that reported. Vance sat by the world. He was now introduction to the month of Bluegrass Holdings. Vance set it in the trail, watching the storefront. It was a dead end, as he expected. A classic drop for a shell company. He drove to the clerk's office at the Fayette County Courthouse. He needed to check property tax records. If Huon had bought the house, the deed transfer would be recorded. He spent an hour in the dusty records room. He found the deed. Grantor, estate of James Sterling. Grantee, Bluegrass Holdings, LLC. Consideration, $450,000. He looked at the mortgage filings. There were none. It was a cash purchase. Huon had used the stolen cash to buy the stolen house. It was an Ouroboros of fraud. But then Vance noticed something else. A second deed, filed only 2 days ago. Grantor, Bluegrass Holdings, LLC. Grantee, Elysium Properties, Cayman. Consideration, $1. Huon was moving the asset offshore. He was layering, putting distance between himself and the property. Vance knew he was running out of time. Once the property was in a Cayman trust, it would be untouchable. The audit trail wouldn't reach that far. He needed leverage. He needed to catch Huon in the act of moving the cars. He called the auction house. Lexington Estate Auctioneers. Good morning, this is Brenda, a cheerful voice chirped. Hi Brenda, this is Arthur Vance from the State Auditor's Office. I'm just doing a final reconciliation on the Sterling file. I see the vehicles were sold to a Bluegrass Holdings. Oh yes, Mr. Vance. We remember that one. Sad about the Corvette. Beautiful car. I need to verify the release date. Have they picked them up yet? Let me check. No, sir. They're scheduled for transport today, actually. A carrier is coming at noon. Noon today? Vance checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. Yes, sir. Going to a warehouse in Louisville, I believe. Thank you, Brenda. You've been very helpful. Vance hung up. He had less than 2 hours. He drove to the auction house, a large metal warehouse on the outskirts of Lexington. He parked across the street in a fast food lot and waited. At 11:45 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the auction lot. Vance raised his binoculars. He kept a pair in the glove box for inspecting real estate assets from a distance.
The driver got out. It wasn't Hewen. It was a man in a windbreaker. But a moment later, the passenger door opened. Charles Hewen stepped out. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was in jeans and a polo shirt, looking like a man on his day off. He looked relaxed. He shook hands with the auctioneer. A car carrier truck rumbled into the lot a few minutes later. They began to load the cars. First the Jaguar, then the Mercedes. Vance picked up his oversized cell phone. He hesitated. Calling the police was still a risk. If the responding officers knew Hewen, Vance could be the one in handcuffs for harassment.
He needed a witness who wasn't law enforcement. He dialed the number for the Lexington Herald-Leader. He asked for the investigative desk. The gruff voice answered, not the guard Miller. This was Greg Miller, a reporter Vance had clashed with during a school board audit years ago. Miller was a pit bull. There was a silence on the line, then the sound of a chair scraping. Vance watched as the Corvette was rolled onto the ramp. The sunlight caught the chrome bumper. It was a beautiful machine, a tangible representation of corruption. Hewen was laughing at something the truck driver said. He clapped the man on the shoulder. Vance stepped out of his car. He crossed the street. He didn't run. He walked with the measured, plodding pace of a man who checks receipts for a living. He walked right through the open gate. Hewen turned. His smile didn't fade immediately. It curdled slowly into a look of confusion, then recognition, then icy stillness. Quote, 398, Hewen said. Vance said, stopping 10 feet away. Hewen's eyes darted to the auctioneer, then to the truck driver. He said. The workman shrugged and moved to the other side of the truck. Hewen stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. Hewen's face hardened. The friendly bureaucrat mask fell away, revealing the cold calculation underneath. Vance said. Hewen sneered. Hewen said. Vance said calmly. He was checked, which he's still there for the work. Yeah. Yes. Vance said. Well, Hewen make follow there. Hewen said. Well, Hewen said. Well, Hewen said. Well, Hewen said. Well, Hewen said. Yes. Yes. Vance said. Hewen said. The workman shrugged and moved to the other side of the truck. Vance said. Yes. Yes. The workman shrugged and moved to the other side of the truck. Vance said calmly. He pointed toward the entrance of the lot. A beat-up Honda Civic screeched into the driveway. Greg Miller hopped out, a camera slung around his neck, a tape recorder already in his hand. He started snapping photos immediately. Click, click, click. The sound was remarkably similar to Vance's adding machine. Hewen paled. Stop! You can't photograph this. This is a secure state operation. Public property, public lot, public official, Miller shouted, advancing. Mr. Hewen, is it true you're the registered agent for the buyer of these vehicles? Hewen scrambled. He looked at the truck driver. Load them. Go. I ain't moving with that camera in my face, the driver said, crossing his arms. Vance watched Hewen unravel. It was a chaotic, messy scene. There was shouting. There was panic. There was no symmetry here. And for the first time in days, Vance felt a sense of balance. The scandal was seismic. The Herald-Leader ran the photos above the fold. The headline, The Zero Variance Fraud. Vance sat in his office in the basement. The box labelled Sterling was gone, seized by the FBI this time. A new box sat on his desk. Hewen, C. Asset Forfeiture Audit. The governor had appointed a special prosecutor. Hewen had been arrested at the airport, trying to board a flight to Grand Cayman. The Elysium Properties transfer hadn't cleared in time. The investigation had widened. They found the missing cash, $510,000, in a safety deposit box in Louisville, registered to Hewen's wife. Vance picked up a new ledger sheet. Total seized from Hewen, $1,450,000. Est. Outstanding liability, unknown. He punched the numbers into the machine. Chunk, chunk, chunk. There was no zero variance today. The numbers were messy. There were legal fees, investigative costs, fluctuating asset values. It would take months,
maybe years to reconcile it all. There would be remainders, there would be questions. Vance tore off the tape. Variance, $14,205.50. He looked at the jagged number. It was ugly. It was imprecise. He smiled, capped his pen, and turned off the light.
It was perfect.